Let's talk about the challenges that we see in healthcare, and let's talk a little bit about where we can see room for improvement and disruption. So imagine for a second if we could begin to design our medicines as opposed to just discover them. What would happen if we could develop a fundamental understanding of what drives disease? Can we transform the way we ensure that medicines are safe and effective? And perhaps most importantly, are there ways to accelerate how we take innovations from the lab bench all the way to the patient bedside? If we could do these things, imagine the impact that we could have on our healthcare system. So as we all know, healthcare is an enormous and growing part of our economy. Today, it accounts for about 20% of our GDP, and that number is going to double over the course of the next 3 decades. This is a $1 trillion challenge that's ripe for disruption. And we're already seeing ways that software is eating healthcare in a broad range of verticals, from data analytics to patient engagement, and even insurance and other services. And we also know that the large incumbents are recognizing the importance of this space. Increasingly, Apple is going to make health a center use case for the Apple Watch. Facebook is looking for ways to use the power of social networks to help us identify and recruit patients for clinical trials. And Google is making a broad range of investments across healthcare and life sciences. As we move beyond software, we're at this point where we're seeing this incredible convergence between biology, computer science, and engineering. And it's this convergence that's going to give us broad new superpowers to understand and manipulate biology. Essentially, we're finding ourselves at the cusp of being able to shift biology from being primarily an experimental science to an engineered discipline. And that's going to have major impacts across the healthcare industry. So let's take the case of medicine, for example. The US biopharmaceutical industry spends about $75 billion every single year in research and development. And they're making those investments in R&D to chase very large markets. The market for drug sales in the United States alone is about $500 billion annually. But despite that large market, most diseases still have incredible unmet medical needs. So the bottom line is that we need better technologies to help us diagnose, treat, and manage most diseases. But here's the curious thing. Drug development, in a lot of ways, is the antithesis of what we've experienced in technology. We actually suffer from something we call Eadward's Law in this space. And Eadward's is just more spelled backwards, where we've actually seen the cost of drug discovery and development increase exponentially over the last several decades. So what accounts for this? What accounts for the Eadward's phenomena? Why is making medicines such a long and expensive and risky process? Well, first of all, it's because you have to make a fundamental discovery that is meaningful for understanding and managing disease. And once you make that discovery, you have to prove that it's going to be safe and effective in human beings. And once you do that, you have to convince the people that matter to use your innovation. And so when you add all of this up, it takes an incredible $2.5 billion and 10 to 15 years of investment to get the average drug to market when you account for all of the failures along the way. So to put this in context, venture capital, our business is considered a risky business. We're hoping 1 in 10 of our investments becomes a hit. In this world, it's 1 in 10,000 becomes a product. And assuming you can even get a drug discovered, the path to getting that drug or a diagnostic to a patient historically has been a very challenging one. There are lots of stakeholders involved. As we already alluded to, your discovery has to go through a regulator. The regulator has to allow you to commercialize a drug, and usually the way we do that is by proving that it's safe and effective, certainly in the case of medicines. But once you've gotten through that hoop, you still have to convince payers that there's fundamental value here that's worth paying for. And once you've gone through that, you've got to ensure you work with partners across the channel, whether they're distributors or pharmacy benefit managers and ultimately pharmacies, to make sure, in the case of drugs, that your drug gets to where it needs to go. And once you've done that, you've got to educate the providers, whether it's doctors or the healthcare systems or the hospital systems, that there's a benefit here for your patients. So as you can see, there's a lot of challenges getting any drug to a patient. And so if you think about it, if the enterprise is B2B and consumer is B2C, then the traditional biopharma is B2B to the R to C to P to C to C. So it's complicated. Now, this is a fundamental question we always ask ourselves. Why is innovation in healthcare so hard? Ben Horowitz wrote this incredibly insightful book about the trials and the tribulations of innovation and entrepreneurship and sales. And I would say to Ben, with all due respect, given the unique challenges that we experience in the healthcare space, I think we deserve a revised edition of this book. So let's talk about some really hard things. Discovery. It's hard. We see this every day. But why? Why is it so hard? What's so hard about making a new medicine? Well, the first thing is, this is going to sound pretty obvious, but you actually have to understand what outcome you're trying to achieve. What are you trying to solve for in terms of deriving a benefit for a patient? Assuming you know that, you have to have a pretty good understanding of what the underlying disease biology is that's going to enable you to achieve that patient benefit. And assuming you know that, you need to have a very good idea of where specifically you're going to target to get that desired outcome. And assuming you know that, you've got to be pretty comfortable you're going to make a medicine that will allow you to hit that target effectively. So let's take two examples of diseases just to put some of this in context. Sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell is an inherited disease that results in horrible, painful crises for patients. So the benefit that you're trying to achieve for them is pretty well known. We also know why these patients have painful crises, because they have an error in their hemoglobin gene that causes their cells to fold or sickle. That's the cause of the painful crisis. So because we understand that, we also know that the best way to address that is to find ways to either repair or replace the faulty hemoglobin. And because we understand the disease at these fundamental layers, there are many groups and scientists and companies that are actually focused on coming up with a medicine for sickle cell that will probably be gene therapy based. And so if I had to bet, I would bet that in the next 10 years, we will have solved sickle cell anemia, much like we've solved cystic fibrosis, that had a very similar profile in terms of what we understood about the disease. But now let's take another disease. Let's look at Alzheimer's. This is an area that has incredible unmet medical need, that has devastating impacts on families, devastating impact on society, and devastating impacts on our economy. And so as a result, it's not surprising that lots of people have looked to find ways to develop new drugs for this horrible, horrible disease. But the problem is, we don't fundamentally understand much about Alzheimer's disease. We don't really understand what benefit we're trying to look for. Are we trying to reverse the disease, stop progression? Are we trying to improve memory recall? Are we trying to improve daily function? We also don't know what causes the disease. Is it plaques in the brain? Is it these neural tangles? Or are those just symptoms of some other underlying cause? And because we don't know that, we obviously don't know what to target. So it's not surprising that the various medicines that have come through over the last several decades have had failures. And in fact, just a few months ago, we had a very high-profile failure with Axivant that had a failure in phase 3 trial after years and years and years of development and hundreds of millions of dollars invested. And it's not that these companies don't know what they're doing, it's that we don't know what Alzheimer's is doing. And that's what makes discovery so hard. So the real truth is the vast majority of drugs fail and are found ineffective or toxic because we don't understand the underlying disease biology. And unfortunately, even when drugs are approved and are found to be effective, there's usually a fair bit amount of luck or serendipity involved. But why are we still so bad at this? What happened to all of these advances that were going to bring cures closer? And if you've been following this space for a very long time, you've no doubt seen the breathless headlines that come where Discovery X is going to cure disease Y, where the next new thing is our new hope. But unfortunately, more often than not so much. In fact, more often than not in our world, we find that when expectation meets reality, we've been, time and time again, disappointed. So what's different this time? This time is different for two fundamental reasons. One, we now have an unprecedented ability to understand biology at a very foundational level. And there have been three primary factors that are really accelerating our ability here. One is we can now do biology at incredible speed and scale. Just look at what's happened in the genomics industry in terms of the ability to sequence a genome better, faster, and cheaper. We can also now increasingly understand biology at the fundamental unit of disease. So scientists at the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT, they've created an atlas of various different cell types so we can understand how different cells function and dysfunction. So understanding disease at a single cell resolution is transformative for our ability to understand disease biology. And thirdly, all of this technology generates incredible amounts of complex data. And most of it is simply beyond our human mind. And so the ability to use artificial intelligence and machine learning is actually allowing us to derive real fundamental insights from all of this data that we're generating. And these new powerful tools and platforms are also driving our ability to fundamentally rethink how we can engineer biology. And so we're seeing this happening at many levels as well. So we're seeing gene therapies emerging from our ability to edit and write and print DNA. We're seeing new curative treatments for diseases like cancer because of our ability to engineer cells. And because we can now engineer biology, we can develop and design entire human biological systems. So let's put this a little bit in context. If you go back 50 years ago, the vast majority of our drugs were chemicals. And this was known as the era of the small molecule medicine. If you fast forward to 25 years ago, the emergence of the biotechnology industry gave us the ability to coax organisms to make proteins for us. And as a result, 7 of the top 10 selling drugs today are protein-based drugs. This is the era of the large molecule medicine. Flash forward to just where we're standing right now. We've just seen recent approvals for cell therapies, for gene therapies, and we've firmly entered the era of the living medicine, where the cell or the gene is the therapeutic. So what's on the horizon? Well, if we get really good at understanding biology and we get really good at engineering biology, on the horizon, we have the ability to begin to program cells so that we can imbue them with logic. So we can take a cell and have it understand how to find disease, what to do when it encounters disease, and how to terminate itself once it's beat the disease. So we are on the cusp of not having not only living medicines, but intelligent medicines. So this is an extraordinary advancement. But it doesn't change the fact that we still need to rethink how we prove that these medicines are safe and effective. So testing continues to be very difficult. So let's go through the paradigm really quickly. So the first thing we do when we want to test if a drug is safe or effective is we ask the question, can this work? And up until now, for the most part, the way we determine if something can work is we test it in mice and in cells sitting in a petri dish. And once we've gotten some comfort that it can work, we of course have to ask the question if it in fact does work. And the way we do this is by recruiting human volunteers to determine if a drug is in fact safe and effective when tested in human beings. So how has this paradigm played out for us? For the most part, not very well. So unfortunately, the story of biotech, the story of pharmaceuticals, is a story of failing big and failing late. Up to 40% of drugs that go through a phase 3 trial fail. 40%. This is after 10 years, a decade, and hundreds of millions of dollars invested. And usually they fail because they don't work or they're toxic. So we really don't understand what we're doing when we go into clinical trials for the most part. Ideally, we would shift this paradigm. We would make this look much more tech-like, where we could actually reduce the risk of failure predictably over time and increase our investment in a specific solution as we get more comfortable that risk has been reduced. But what would that paradigm actually look like? Well, the first thing we'd need to do is change the way we think about preclinical testing. It turns out that mice and petri dishes are not the best ways to figure out if something's going to work in a human being. So what if we could actually test drugs in humans before we test them in humans? What you're looking at here is an engineered lung on a chip. What engineers have done here is they've taken the cells that form the structure and function of a lung and put them in a microengineered environment. This chip breathes like a regular lung, oxygenates blood like a regular lung, and in fact, under a microscope, looks nearly identical to human lung tissue. And so you can test drugs here to see if they're having any damage in lungs. And scientists are developing other models, other chips for other organs. So we're not too far from being in a time and place where we have an entire human being or a human system on a chip. So this technology is really going to give us the power to actually have preclinical testing be predictive. But that doesn't change the fact that we're still going to have to test drugs in human beings. But we have 3 or 4 things going for us here that are going to help us disrupt this paradigm as well. The first one is powerful new medicines are emerging that are having outsized impact in our ability to impact disease. And when you combine that with the fact that we're on the precipice of being able to have more predictive preclinical testing models, and you combine that with the fact that as we understand disease biology more fundamentally, we're going to get much better at predicting who will or won't respond to a clinical trial, we're entering the era of really effective, high signal-to-noise trials where excellent drugs reveal themselves early, and hopefully where drugs that won't work are filtered out early as well. And we're also getting a very big assist from the entire technology industry. So Facebook, for example, as I mentioned earlier, is using their social network to help us identify and recruit patients for clinical trials. And in fact, they did a pilot project with the Michael J. Fox Foundation where they were able to reduce the cost and time associated with finding volunteers by 96%. 96%. And the cost to enroll and find patients for clinical trials is one of the biggest drivers of timelines and cost associated with drug development. So this is going to have a very fundamental impact in how we think about clinical trials. So even assuming we improve that, go-to-market is still hard, as we talked about at the beginning. Now, the good news is that not every innovation that emerges from this convergence between biology and computer science and engineering necessarily needs to be a drug or a diagnostic. In fact, a lot of these powerful tools that emerge have a very large home market in terms of the $75 billion annual spend that happens in R&D. And perhaps the most illustrative example of the potential of these kinds of companies is Illumina. Illumina essentially invented next-generation sequencing, became the dominant force in it, and has created a $30 billion market cap company as a result. And every other logo on this slide has fundamentally changed the way we engineer a slice of R&D, whether it's mRNA or DNA synthesis or monoclonal antibodies, and as a result have been rewarded with incredible valuations and incredible opportunities to partner with pharmaceutical players in the R&D industry. And for those companies that are looking to develop transformative medicines or transformative diagnostics, we also see countless examples of new modalities emerging. We've also seen in the news how Kite Pharma and Spark Therapeutics are bringing us cell therapies and gene therapies. They're now available for patients. And so this is already happening. And as a result, this question of regulatory risk is largely being addressed by more powerful medicines. In fact, people tend to think that FDA risk is this huge roadblock to getting a drug approved. But FDA risk or regulatory risk is really just another way of saying scientific risk, of saying we're going to conduct an experiment and we're not quite sure what's going to happen. In some ways, it's like blaming the referee when your team loses a game. And I think that's what's been happening. I'm a Miami Dolphins fan, so I totally understand that instinct, but it's essentially what's been happening. But if we look at the scoreboard of what's happening as these new therapies emerge, the FDA has become an incredible ally for the industry. This year, we'll see more generics approved. This year, we'll see we saw the first gene therapy approved. We saw the first cell therapy approved. We saw the first digital therapeutic approved. Just this week, I saw that there's a digital pill approved that has a sensor on it so doctors can ensure that there's compliance. That's a first of its kind, also approved. And so we're seeing more and more wins like this happening from the regulatory bodies. So I think, if anything, the FDA has become an incredible collaborator to industry. What about payers? Well, same thing. Historically, the big question is, well, who's going to pay for this? Payers are looking to cut costs. But the reality is payers aren't cost cutters. They're assessors of value. And if you have transformative drugs, or if you can transform how we think about diagnosing and screening disease, the payers are willing to pay for that value. In fact, there is a new drug therapy that's referred to in this top headline for helping reverse an inherited form of blindness. If you can cure blindness, payers are willing to pay for that value. I had a conversation with the head of a large New England-based payer network, and he said, well, the headline's a bit misleading because it says it's $1 million drug. No, it's for blindness. It's $1 million per eye, and most people have two. So this is a $2 million drug, but we'll still pay for it. Why? Because it works. What about the channel? What about the distributors? This historically has been a space that has captured a significant amount of margin across the value chain. And for various reasons. Drugs are complex, there's a complex supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. But what's also true is, as Jeff Bezos has famously said, when there's big margin, there's opportunity. And that hasn't escaped Amazon. So Amazon is looking to find ways to disrupt this space. So watch this space, I'm sure interesting things will happen. And finally, providers. Providers are, of course, the front line for making sure patients are treated well and diseases managed and detected early and so on and so on. And providers, for the most part, are very similar to payers. They're looking for ways to ensure that their patients derive value from new therapies or derive value from new diagnostics. And in fact, as there's a shift to value takes place, the ability to emerge with powerful new tools and technologies is very firmly aligned with that in terms of providing customized, safe, transformative care for patients. And ultimately, the patient is, of course, the beneficiary of all of this innovation. And we're finally getting to the point where innovation cycles are happening more quickly. We're seeing time from innovation benchtop to bedside accelerate. We're seeing that finally we're getting the promise of precision medicine where the right therapy is going to the right patient at the right time and at the right dose. And we're also seeing that as we understand disease biology more fundamentally and as there's a shift to value-based care, that the ability to use prevention as a form of therapy is finally becoming a reality. And so really for the first time, we're seeing alignment across the entire value chain. And this is a very, very exciting time to be in healthcare as a result. But what's also very exciting is that bio is not an industry in and of itself. It's primarily thought of as a healthcare industry, but it's increasingly becoming a part of every industry. We're already seeing this convergence of biology and computer science and engineering impacting industries as diverse as food, what Appeal's trying to do to disrupt food waste, to consumer products. Bolt threads and modern meadows are actually using bacteria and other organisms to make silk and leather for us, to what's been happening in energy. And companies like Asimov are rethinking how we can design cells to have it impact a broad range of industries that are based on manufacturing. So we're living at this incredible point in time where biology is going to look a lot like information technology, and that it's going to be able to tackle and transform and perhaps even disrupt multiple industries. And in some ways, biology is having us rethink information technology itself. So what you're seeing here on the left is Eadward Muybridge's famous set of photographs of a galloping horse. On the right, what scientists were able to do is they were able to take this video, the pixels from this video, and using CRISPR, can coax a bacterial cell to ingest the information and store it in its DNA. And on the right, what you're seeing is scientists' ability to retrieve that video from the cells and replay it. And so in some ways, we've come full circle. Biology is the original information technology. DNA is our software, cells are our original hardware. And so I'm going to leave you here with this very curious case of biology eating software.